Q&A later on at the end. So I ask you, thank you so much for those of you who submitted your questions ahead of time. I ask those who are listening in to please ask your questions in the chat. We will try to answer as many as we can live, and if not, we will get back to you after the event. So you can either go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, click on the Q&A button and enter your question there. You can enter it in the chat box. And also, if you are watching the Zoom on the Zoom live stream, you can put in, we'll be monitoring that as well. Finally, help us spread the word and get this critical out to our community by sharing this live stream out. Share it with all of your friends and family. We want to make sure that we get the truth of what happened this legislative session out to everyone. We are going to send information out at the end about how to get involved, how to stay connected. But in the meantime, you can join us on Twitter. Our handle is @MD Police Reform. Follow us on Twitter for any major updates and action items, as well as on Facebook under the coalition name. So now that all of that is out of the way, it is my extreme honor to introduce our host for this evening, Mr. Jonathan Hutto. And I'm sure Jonathan needs absolutely no introduction, but I'm very honored to do it. As Jonathan has been a human rights organizer, an activist on the front lines for decades here in Maryland. I have learned so much from him, and I know so many people on this call and listening in have learned so much from him as well. Like I said, for years, he's been on the front lines fighting in the struggle against police brutality, advocating for real police reform in Maryland, most notably for those who know him in Prince George's County. His efforts and his leadership in the Prince George's People have been critical in bringing the county's police department to a place of greater transparency and oversight. And now, of course, and always, his efforts have been amplified and been critical in lifting up our reforms and passing critical reforms on the statewide level in our coalition. So again, it is my honor. Jonathan, thank you so much for leading us today. And I will pass it over to you to get us started.
All right, Sister Catherine, can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up? Hear me okay? Great, wonderful. Sister Catherine, thank you so much from the depths of my soul for that introduction. I'm extremely humbled by the introduction. I'm honored as well, but I'm extremely humbled. And thank you, and thanks to Yannette for the assignment for tonight. I appreciate you all. I'm honored and humbled to be assigned this task for this evening. And before we get started, today, as we all know, has been a year from the day. Excuse me? We're all good? We're set? Okay, awesome. As we all know, today has been exactly a year since George Floyd, peace be upon his name, peace be upon the name of George Floyd. We wrap our arms around his family, both the movement family and his nuclear blood family. It's been a year since he was viciously taken from us, and it was his last breath in the streets there in Minneapolis that inspired, re-inspired, energized, and sparked a mass movement that is still ongoing, that many of us were already a part of, but just pressed us ever more forward, ever onward. So right now, I just want to take a moment of silence. Just take about at least 30 seconds to a minute. Let's honor George Floyd in the way that you feel most appropriate. All right, family. Thank you so much. I don't want to be too long with an introduction. I just want to set a tone for us for the night. My job and assignment tonight is to move the agenda forward, to move the conversation forward. Most importantly, for us to at the end summate towards a plan of action going forward. I was, I'm latter part of Generation X, right? So I'm that generation born in late '70s where we were young enough to be touched by the civil rights, Black Power, and Vietnam peace generation, but then old enough to mature to a point where we have seen that generation begin to transition from this life in many ways. But still, we're trained with that ethos. And one of the principles that I was trained under is that not under but trained with is that we don't always, at least in our struggle, in the Black liberation struggle, we don't judge it always by the heights that we achieve, but we judge it by the depths from which we've come, the depths from which we come as a people. And so with that principle, I think about, I just want to set a framework here. I just to set a framework for us going forward. I think about, my grandparents' generation. There would have been a case, an infamous case known as the Scottsboro Boys. These were 13 African-American males, Holborn during the Great Depression era. Some of you know that story. It became the case of that era, a serious travesty of justice that went on for almost a decade. The last Scottsboro boy there, Clarence Norris, exonerated by the state of Alabama in 1976. He was the last one living. For my mother's generation, my mother's in her early 70s today, there was a case of Emmett Till, 1954. Many of you know that case, what happened there in Money, Mississippi, to a child, to a teenage boy, by vicious, racist vigilantes, and the travesty of justice there. In my lifetime as a teenager, in high school, that case was the case of Rodney King. It was the first time many people saw police brutality televised, or recorded rather, in such a way, such a vicious and inhumane way, and then to have the officers exonerated in our faces. In the early 2000s, names like Abner Louima, Amadou Diallo, right here in the state of Maryland, Archie Elliott, peace be upon his name, Gary Hopkins, his mother's with us tonight on the board of the Maryland ACLU, Marion Gray Hopkins, peace be upon his name. These names of mostly African-American males, we come into the Black Lives Matter era. Trayvon Martin, killed by a vigilante there in Sanford, Florida, not guilty. 2015, Ferguson, not guilty. Michael Brown. In Baltimore, the Rough Rider, Freddie Gray, again, not guilty in the courts, but there was some justice that was taken out in the streets, which inspired some reform legislation. So when we speak to the depths in which we come, and there's many names I could name, but the point is that when we come to this moment of what recently took place in Minneapolis, we know that it is because of the strength of our movement. A movement when I first got involved. I can't say we because there are people who were involved before I got involved. When we first got involved, we didn't have a statewide coalition, Marion, as broad as this. We didn't have a statewide coalition as deep as this. We didn't have a research, not just research arm, but research arms, plural, like the Leaders of Beautiful Struggle and the ACLU, folks who provide stellar research and stellar analysis for grassroots activists to get engaged and to get involved. We didn't have this kind of statewide. I keep focusing on statewide because we certainly had it in pocketed regions in Prince George's County with coalitions, right? But to bring the tribes together, as this Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability has done, to bring the tribes of the state of Maryland together for us to forge a fist. In my childhood, that was known as Voltron, a cartoon we used to watch. We used to come together as a fist to bring together our unity and to harness our power. Let me say that when we first came to Annapolis, and I'm gonna end in about 2 or 3 minutes. We first came to Annapolis, at least when I first came to Annapolis in 2000. We couldn't even get a bill heard. All we could do was get it introduced. We couldn't even get it heard. I think the guy's name was Joseph Valerio. Wasn't that the chairman of the committee there in the House? We couldn't even get the bill heard, you know. So in terms of looking at the depths from which we've come, and tonight you're going to hear some stellar analysis. You're going to hear from folks who are in the trenches, in the weeds of the legislative session. They're going to break down for us how far we've come, and they're going to break down for us how much further we have to go. But we do want to celebrate, if that's the right word, or at least acknowledge, maybe not celebrate, that's the wrong term. At least acknowledge. I don't want to say celebrate. At least acknowledge the progress that we've made as activists, as fighters, and as practitioners, and to recognize that it was not the result of the benevolence of electoral politicians. It was the result of activists and the practitioners on this line, both on the panel and throughout the attendee audience, who rolled up their sleeves, who made the phone calls, who knocked on the doors, who did the drive-bys in that way, meaning the stretch out cars in front of the legislative houses, who made it happen in the streets. And so we want to come together to assess, we want to come together to acknowledge, and then we want to come together plan and to strategize, because it's not over. The movement's not over. A luta continua, the struggle continues. And so with that, we're going to move forward here. I think I've said quite enough. I don't want to talk long, but I want to at least set a framework for us going forward. And so at this point, if it's okay, Kat and Yannette, I'm gonna go ahead and move towards just a recap of what our demands were as a coalition. Again, as you see before you, the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability. We had 5 critical demands that we strategized on months before the beginning of the legislative session. And one of those demands, which has been a key demand from this advocacy engine, but just from justice advocates throughout the state, and even our supporters outside the state of Maryland. I have people that they've called me outside the state of Maryland. Our key flagship demand was the full repeal, the abolishment of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. And we can say that we have definitely moved the ball on that. I'm going to frame it that way in terms of moving the ball forward. You're going to hear a little later from our analysts and our experts in the field on how that ball was moved. We also, our second demand was looking at restoring control of the Baltimore City Police Department to the residents of Baltimore City. This was a relic of the Civil War past of Maryland. You know, Maryland was a supposed border state, border state. In other words, a union state that had enslaved Africans in it. So this was a relic of that Civil War past that was never corrected, if you will. And so we're going to get an update in terms of where we are in that realm. Transparency in the investigations of police misconduct. Transparency in terms of accessing the records of the Maryland Public Information Act. We're going to get an update in terms of how the ball was moved there, limiting the use of force by law enforcement. That has become a national outcry in terms of these chokeholds, knees on necks, backs breaking, officers going beyond any sort of human civil control, even after the verdict in Minneapolis. Travesty is still happening, bodies are still being broken. And so what has taken place in terms of limiting use of force? And finally, how are we going to assess still the presence of officers, the presence of these uniformed men and women and bodies within our public school system? We know on this line that is the militarization of our schools. We know that it's a pipeline. The research has shown it's a pipeline directly to the prison industrial complex. And so how are we going to begin to assess how we go forward from there? So with that being stated, I want to bring up a gentleman that I've met roughly. I met this gentleman at least about a decade ago. And I have been beyond inspired by him and beyond inspired by the organization that they founded out of Baltimore, Maryland. When I first met them, I thought, and I make no qualms about saying this, I thought I was seeing the reemergence of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I mean, they came with an energy that combined activism, it combined advocacy, it brought in research, most importantly, a deep, deep love for Black folks, deep love for Black people across the spectrum of Black people. And they're intergenerational in the way that they work. They're intergenerational in terms of reaching through the generations, from the boomers to the Gen Xers, the millennials, and even my sons in generation back up. I really have appreciated deeply the research analysis that they've done. One thing I highlight that I remember, just one anecdote. I remember years ago, you remember when it was a focus on, and still a focus on bail reform, and just the analysis they brought on that, highlighting legislators in our county, folks like the former state senator C. Anthony Muse and his connection to the bail reform industry. I would have never known that as intricately as I do right now had it not been for the research of Davon Love and the leaders of A Beautiful Struggle. He's going to come forth to us right now, give us the analysis of how the ball was moved on Leopold and compare the analysis he gives to that which came out from the national press. And so, Davon, thank you so much. We love you. Appreciate you, Davon.
Yep. Love you too, brother. Appreciate the introduction. It's an honor to be on with you and to all the other panelists and to everyone that's attending. What I want to do before I get into the specifics of what's here on the PowerPoint and talk a little bit about the specific legislative mechanics, I do want to give some context for LEOBR that I think is important for people to understand what we're going to talk about in terms of the specific legislative pieces. So first, it's really important for folks to recognize LEOBR was established back in 1974. There was an effort upon law enforcement to react to the Black liberation struggle, right? So some people call it the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, but it was a reaction to many of the gains that were being made as a result of much of the activity, the advocacy of folks that were on the ground. And a part of what had happened was that the LEOBR was an attempt to institutionalize a response. So when you think about the middle and late 60s, many of the urban rebellions that happened as a result, these were rebellions, many of them the result of police killings that then resulted in uprisings. And out of those came demands around community control. Community control was something that was applied to a variety of different other kinds of issues. So whether it's the anti-poverty programs, the action programs, but policing was one of the areas where community control emerged as a dominant perspective and policy proposal from the traditional civil rights organizations to some of the more radical Black Power organizations. And when we think about law enforcement as an institution, law enforcement as an institution has been hostile to peoples of African descent. So whether we're talking about the counterintelligence program and its collaboration with local law enforcement against Black folks seeking for liberation for Black folks, so we talk about, for instance, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, where Eddie Conway was a political prisoner in Maryland for 44 years. It was the collaboration of law enforcement that was a part of it. Or whether we're talking about the antipathy, right? The policy stances that the Fraternal Order of Police, that's the unit that represents law enforcement, has taken against Black people. So if you look at some of the rhetoric the FOP has used to describe Black people as inherently criminal, and they've always supported policies that perpetuate mass incarceration. So when we think about the emergence of mass incarceration and policies to try to challenge it, the FOP has always been on the side of the policies that have negatively impacted Black people. So as an institution, law enforcement has been hostile to the humanity of people of African descent. So the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, it was an attempt to institutionalize the ability for law enforcement to control every aspect of the process for discipline. Because the rhetoric the FOP and law enforcement used to characterize community control was rhetoric around the coalition to push for community control was characterized as anti-American, anti-police, right? So this was the rhetoric that was used, and the LEOBR was a piece that complemented the efforts in reacting to these social movements. So that's important because, as Jonathan mentioned, one of the major demands was the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. And the big piece as to why there was such a focus on that is because the LEOBR, as it was structured, it allowed law enforcement to control every aspect of the disciplinary process of law enforcement, such that it obscured the ability for community to have a meaningful role in investigating and disciplining officers that harm the community, right? So when we talk about the issue of repealing the LEOBR and the conversation around what to replace it with, because one of the complicated things about the LEOBR, there's a lot of labor law, right, that is involved in the LEOBR because it's structured as a labor agreement. So it's a
Okay, waiting on Davon to come back. Davon's video froze on us. I'm gonna send Davon a message right now.
All right, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I had to move to get better. So I don't know was the last place that people could hear me. So I'll just start with the demand to repeal LEOBR. It had to be complemented with what to replace it with, because with the concern was that fraternal orders of police in local jurisdictions will negotiate contracts that would replicate the LEOBR in their particular jurisdictions. So when we talk about the issue of we had to repeal LEOBR, but we soon recognized that it was important to replace it. So the bill that the coalition supported, Senate Bill, as you see on the screen, Senate Bill 627, HB 151, sponsors Senator Joe Carter, Delegate Gabriel Acevedo. There were, as you see on the screen, there are a few major components of what that bill did. One of the things, and you can read what's on there. I'm gonna highlight what I think is the most important parts. One is that one of the issues with the LEOBR and just generally with law enforcement is that the mechanisms of accountability are diffuse, right? So police chiefs would be able to say, because of the LEOBR, I can't discipline law enforcement, even when it wasn't true. Right? Police chiefs would blame the LEOBR as a barrier to disciplining officers that needed to be disciplined. We were clear that there's no process that can be developed that would give us 100% community participation in terms of what we wanted, in terms of community control. So what we understood was that we needed to streamline the process for discipline such that there was a target that one could be held accountable. And in that context, that was the police chief. So a big part of what we wanted to do was to eliminate the trial boards, because the trial boards develop an extra layer of power, of diffusion of power, such that it was hard to hold chiefs accountable for the activities. And the ACLU will tell you that in cases where they sued police departments, one of the ways that police departments have defended themselves against accusations of discrimination within the departments is to say that the final decisions weren't up to them and blame the trial boards, right? So we wanted to streamline those who were held accountable so the public could exercise its ability to pressure folks to hold the police chief accountable. Most important part of the legislation was it allowed local jurisdictions to create external oversight entities that can conduct investigations, that can adjudicate and impose discipline on officers who engage in harm against the community, and allow that body to have the power that a chief would have in the default arrangement where a chief would ultimately be responsible. So it gave jurisdictions the option of being able to establish those oversight entities. Last thing I'll say on the bill that we supported going in, because some people would ask us, why not mandate? Why not mandate that each jurisdiction should establish an entity, an external community oversight entity? And the reason that we said not to mandate it is because there are remote places around the state where a community oversight entity actually may take us in the opposite direction, that you may have more pro-law enforcement in remote areas. And so we wanted it to be a thing where the jurisdiction had to affirmatively say they wanted that power, as opposed to requiring it in context where it actually may be harmful. All right, next slide. So what actually passed? So the coalition gave this the score of a C-. And so what actually passed? So LEOBR did get repealed. One of the things that it maintains the existence of these trial boards. Again, these trial boards, them having ultimate decision-making power is something that undermines the ability for the community to really hold a particular person accountable. And again, it just adds another layer of protection for law enforcement. Now, what many of the proponents will say is that the trial board is, the members of the trial board are appointed by the police accountability boards, which I'll get to later, because many of them are civilians. But one of the things I want to say about that is that while that's better than an all police trial board, right, it's still a process that lives within the police department, right? Now, one of the positive things that the bill does is that it does require civilian participation in many of the different aspects of the process that it lays out. So it requires civilians to serve on these administrative charging committees, which I'll talk about in a moment. It requires civilians to be a part of the police accountability boards, which I'll also talk about in a minute. So it does require more civilian participation. So folks that are not law enforcement are now going to be more involved in the internal process for disciplining police officers. So that's really the most positive thing about HB 670 that ultimately passed, and it's going to become law. Next slide. One of the things I'll say, one of the big issues during session was the expungement of police records. And I think it's important that when we talk about the expungement of police records, Yannette's going to talk about the Maryland Public Information Act, but I want to actually flag that here, because this was something that was going to be very important, because there was a push to expunge police records that was put in this bill that luckily we were able to fight against. You'll see why that's important when we talk about the Maryland Public Information Act. And as you see on the screen, it gives some criteria for how a chief is allowed to fire an officer. I saw a question about why it take the impacts of it taking effect in July 2022. I'll get to that at the end. All right, next slide. Police accountability boards. So what the bill does is that every jurisdiction is required to establish a police accountability boards. And as you see on the screen, these are the responsibilities of the police accountability boards. The key thing that I want to focus on, the police accountability boards is the closest thing to an external oversight body that this bill produces. Now, what this police accountability board does do is that it does appoint folks to the administrative charging committees, which I'll talk about. That's the next slide. It does appoint the people who are on the trial boards, right? Which is, again, which is a net positive, right? As the slide mentions, it talks about the, quarterly meetings with police leadership and all of that. The problem is that for us, this external body should have its own authority to investigate and impose discipline on law enforcement. Because in theory, this is the body that would be most representative of the community. And this is the body that should be able to act on behalf of the community. So this was actually during session, we were trying to make it so that this body would actually have those powers. That was ultimately rejected both by the Judiciary Committee and rejected on the floor. So that was an amendment that would have helped to stem some of our issues. The existence of the trial board still muddied the power that we wanted to give the community. But yeah, so that's the police accountability boards. And then I believe it's the next slide. I think it's the last slide on LEOBR, I think. administrative charging committees. So this was a particular innovation that, and one of the things that, folks have probably seen myself and other members of the coalition say, is that this just is a lot of process. The administrative charging committee essentially allows for these charging committees are responsible for reviewing investigations, the outcome of investigations of law enforcement. And they would provide a recommendation to the chief as to whether or not an officer should be administratively charged for a alleged act of misconduct. These charge committees again are appointed by the police accountability boards, and for the most part, they are non-law enforcement. So on one hand, it's a benefit again because it's more ways that civilians can participate. But again, none of these bodies are external to the formal process of discipline that give community the ability to impose discipline. And so that's something that we want to talk more about. We'll talk more about. So I think this is the last slide on LEOBR. I think I do see some questions that it may make sense. I think the last slide is trial boards. Is that so police accounting boards, minute charging, trial boards. I already talked about the trial boards. So that was the last. So let's see. So Jonathan, should I do some of the questions now, or should we wait till the end? How you want to do it?
Probably be good to knock out a few now. I see there's 6 questions under the Q&A. So one question which you may have already answered was from Lynn and Kim Thornton asked, how can civilians be on the boards? You may want to reiterate that in terms of how civilians can be on the boards.
So the police accountability boards are entities that that'll be required to be developed by each jurisdiction. The membership of those police accountability boards are constituted by a ordinance of the local government, the ordinance of the local council. So in terms of how to be on those boards, each person should go to your local legislative body and inquire about the process that they're going to construct to establish those police accountability boards. So those processes aren't prescribed specifically by the repeal of LEOBR, but again, the composition of those boards are up to the local jurisdictions to create a local ordinance that would establish those protocols. So reach out to your local legislature, your local council, and they'll be able to give you some direction as to what that process will look like in your jurisdiction.
And then this next question from Rob Lando hits on an aspect that we had to deal with after the 16 legislative session when chiefs did gain the power to put civilians on those trial boards. And his question that hits on that is, can you discuss the concern about whether police unions and local governments can try to circumvent these anti-bargaining prohibitions before the laws take effect?
And that actually reminds me, I think I saw a question about this too that someone brought up. So the effective date for the bill is July 2022, right? Most bills that pass this session, they usually go into effect either July 1 or October 1. There are a variety of reasons why the leadership would have decided to make it the effective date out a year, right? Some of those reasons, bear some legitimacy, right? So for instance, the establishment of the police accountability boards, I imagine there's some administrative and quite frankly, some bureaucratic work that needs to be done to set up these structures, right? I'm sure state government needs to do some things as to how they would even regulate these. And that probably takes a lot of work. So there are probably some legitimate reasons as to why the effective date was put out a year. The concern though, and we don't, and those of us that have discussed this don't necessarily have a solution to this, but the concern is that if between now and the effective date, a jurisdiction renegotiates their contracts to include some of what was in the pre-existing LEOBR, then by law, those contracts have to be honored the duration of those contracts, which would then delay the actual effective date of these laws on that jurisdiction, right? So let me just say that again, just to make sure I'm being clear. So the negative impact of the effective date being July 1 is that if a jurisdiction decides to renegotiate a contract with the FOP between now and before the effective date, they will be able to include aspects of the previous LEOBR in their contract, which would mean that the actual effective date on that jurisdiction of the laws that are in what passed wouldn't take effect until that contract expires. So that is actually a real concern. We haven't really figured out a legislative way to address that. That's something that all of us should try to monitor to make sure we can push back against that if in fact that is something that happens.
One question that I want to put forth, Davon, is how does the establishment of the police accountability boards affect jurisdictions like Prince George's County, Maryland, even Baltimore City that already have civilian oversight structures in place? Will those civilian oversight structures then just integrate the police accountability board structure within it? Where they have to it's going to be interesting to see how that happens and then what advice would you give the advocates on the ground in terms of how we should press upon our local structures to make sure that happens effectively?
So that's a good question. I'm actually real clear in terms of Baltimore City that we're going to have to go back and do something legislatively, because Baltimore City's Civilian Review Board was created by a state law back in 1999. So we're going to have to go back and figure out a way to reconcile the two, right? I know Prince George's County has a Civilian Review Board that I believe was created by a local ordinance. So those jurisdictions, I think there will need to be legislative work in the next session for those jurisdictions that have Civilian Review Boards. We're going to have to negotiate what we do. And I don't know that it'll be acceptable, at least in Baltimore City, to just say dissolve it, because it's an entity that already operates, that has members that, so there's going to need to be some legislative fix to that. And again, it's one of the reasons why for us, the bill we proposed, it authorized jurisdictions to develop that on their own, whereas a state-imposed police accountability boards, making them mandatory, then it obscures some of the work that local folks may have established, i.e. the Civilian Review Board, obscure what we want to do in terms of how we want to hold law enforcement accountable. So that's definitely something we're going to have to go back and fix.
Got to dig in. We got Nicole here with a question that points to just the reality of having to keep the pressure on. She states, you may have already answered this in some way, Davon, but she states, so that I understand correctly, I'm reading her verbatim, so that I understand correctly, the local city and county councils choose the members of PABs based on their own determined criteria. A challenge that we regularly face locally is that members of boards and commissions are not diverse racially, geographically. I think this gets to the question, Davon, of how can we as advocates obtain some level of influence and leverage over who gets selected for these boards? And what does the legislation that passed points to how that selection process takes place? Or is that something that chiefs and politicians have sole autonomy over?
So I think that, so two things. One is, one of the recommendations that we made to leadership was to make it so that the procedure for constituting the police accountability boards were the subject of a local legislative action. And the reason we suggested that is because if we think about what are the most open processes that grassroots activists have access to, because if you just route it through the executive, well, that's still a lot of distance between the average person and the county executive. But making it a local legislative ordinance gives grassroots activists more leverage points to pressure their local county council people to be able to structure it in such a way that there's more diversity in terms of the kinds of folks that get appointed to those boards. So what I would say about that is take advantage of that opportunity, and if sufficiently organized, drive the process, right? Create, like, this is an opportunity for people to create the process by which those boards are constituted. And so that's a place where organizing is going to be key.
Mm-hmm. And then to piggyback on the principle you hit in terms of organizing being key, Davon, we have a question here from Nancy Suring. Her question verbatim: next year is an election year for all members of the General Assembly. I think, Nancy speaking, it's likely that over the summer and fall, the FOP will be leaning on legislators to reconsider full repeal. Am I wrong, she asked? If you think this is a possibility, do you believe that legislators who voted for repeal will stand strong, or will this coalition need to organize to show up support?
I mean, I think there are a variety of answers to that. One is that I think the national landscape is such where law enforcement as an institution sees itself as real. And they're using, tactics that are different from tactics that they've used in the past to try to overcome what I believe is the kind of national sentiment. So I do think that law enforcement will try to pressure legislators in the opposite direction where we want them to go. I don't know how successful they will be, but we're going to have to continue to press, because law enforcement still is a very powerful institution. And regardless of its current PR challenges, it still wields a tremendous amount of power, both in terms of its resources, in terms of the lobbyists that it's able to have to push their position, and just their deep relationships with powerful people in positions of leadership. We're going to have to continue to press. One thing I want to correct, because there's a couple of things that I wanted to correct that I mentioned before. The trial boards, I saw someone mention, it's one of the people on the so it's 3 trial board members. One of them is appointed by the police accountability boards. One is a police of equal rank, and the other is an administrative law judge. So it's one of the people on the trial boards is a civilian. I wanted to bring that up because what leadership will say is that there's civilian participation on the trial boards. Having one civilian on a trial board doesn't constitute, substantive civilian participation. I think that, but I want to make sure that we're clear. And the reason why I wanted to go back and respond to that is because even if the trial boards were entirely civilian, these are still boards that exist within the internal disciplinary structure of law enforcement. And what we have been advocating for is an external entity that has the power to impose discipline against officers that harm people in the community.
And that's a good segue, Davon, to a question that I probably should ask you earlier, that you were very strident on the press, and we thank you for it, especially even after the Washington Post wrote that celebratory piece. And that is making it clear. So if you can do this just once again, just the difference between community participation and community oversight. Like what is the from your perspective and our perspective, what is the major difference there?
So when we go back and we look at the advocacy around police accountability from the traditional civil rights organizations and those that are more radical, one of the consistent things that all of them advocated for was an external entity that the community controlled that would be able to impose discipline on law enforcement. This is different from having people that are able to participate in the internal process for police discipline of law enforcement. The difference is very important. And the importance of that difference is this, is that the external entity, what they were advocating for is something that the community controlled, right? That they weren't imbued by police, law enforcement, procedure, and practice. That it was an external entity that the community had ownership of. And what that does is that there's a level of independence and a level of community ownership that, again, we talk about the overall push towards community control, like that was a part of the thrust from a policy perspective during that particular era, right? So when we talk about community oversight, we're not talking just purely from this is Davon's opinion or this is the ACLU's opinion. This is based on the historic advocacy of folks in the Black radical tradition who have advocated for police accountability. And so the difference matters because merely having individuals within the internal police process, it doesn't necessarily empower the community. That may empower individual people that may be more likely to act in the public interest, but that doesn't empower the community itself to actually exercise power. They're still sharing power with an institution that historically has demonstrated its lack of respect for our humanity as a people. So that distinction is a very important, not just an academic distinction, but it's a distinction that matters because what the community wants is power. The community wants power to levy consequences at folks that harm the community. And merely being able to participate in their process doesn't give that to the community.
And then based on that piece, Davon, if you can just reiterate, if you haven't already, I know part of legislation as, civilians to the trial boards, that was even done years ago in 2016. But just to reiterate, why are the trial boards a problem from our perspective? Why are they problematic just institutionally as a whole?
So there are two main problems with the trial boards. The first is that the trial boards, when you think about a person at their job, like public safety in theory is a public good, right? So when we go to the ballot box, a part of what we're contesting is who can deliver us public safety, right? So the way it's supposed to be set up is these are folks that work for us, right? If anybody who works for a company, if you get caught stealing, right, you don't necessarily get a trial of your peers because a part of what the responsibility is I need you to deliver this good in a way that's effective for our community, right? So instead of having an internal trial board process, this is why we focus so much on the civilian oversight, right? Because if anybody's going to judge it, it should be the community who's being served that is the ultimate judge of the quality of the work that law enforcement official is doing, right? So that's one piece, is that it obscures what should really be the case, which is the community oversight piece. The other issue with the trial boards, particularly given its composition, one of the other problems with the trial boards is that when we want to hold a police chief accountable, if the trial board's decision is final, it allows police chiefs to sidestep accountability. And the public needs a clear target to be able to say, because holding a administrative law judge accountable, who are they accountable to? They're not accountable to us. We didn't hire them, right? Mm-hmm. And even having a civilian, an individual civilian that's on the trial board, right? They're not in charge of the institution of the police department, right? So we want to be able to hold the department accountable. And so the trial boards, a part of what they do is they make it so that power is diffuse and it doesn't give us a straight line of accountability that would allow the community to exercise the power it does have at the ballot box to say, if you can't deliver this good of public safety or you deliver it in a way that's harmful to the community, we're going to replace you. It robs the community of having that clear target.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Good stuff. One other question I asked Davon before you, summate and give us some marching orders going forward. It was pretty clear to me, and I'm sure to many others, if not all of us, that and I love the way you nuanced it. Let me just say that in terms of the way the quote unquote victory in parentheses was being presented. Say in the Washington Post, for example, I had people calling me outside of Maryland. Hey, congratulations on the work there in Maryland. I had to say, see a few other snippets. How do we, for those who want to be clear, how would we distinguish where we are as a statewide coalition in terms of how we assess what took place? Like if we had to frame it, if we could frame it in a paragraph or 2 or 3 sentences, how would we frame what took place with Leah Boyd last session versus the way the the Democratic Party, the chair, House Speaker Adrian, how they frame it. How would we frame it?
We should frame it as there was objectively progress made, right? So objectively, because it wouldn't be true to say that they did nothing, and it wouldn't be true to say that what happened didn't open up any doors for positives moving forward, right? I think the issue is when we talk about this environment around racial justice, it's now cool to be associated with an effort that's called racial justice. This was not that, right? So it's an objectively a move forward, but racial justice, as I've said, and the coalition has published things in the past that have said, we're talking about racial justice is about putting power into the hands of people of color, people of African descent, people who are oppressed. And only to the extent that we've done that can we call something racial justice. What HB 670 didn't put power into the hands of the community, right? It opened some doors, it opened some transparency, it created some avenues for outside to see what's happening on the inside. But until we actually have community oversight, until the community has full power over the institution that's supposed to serve us, that's the only thing that we would be able to credibly say is racial justice, right? And I take that very seriously, as you do, as people that are legatees of a tradition that requires that certain things be met. And I think there's some people who have taken that personally, some people who think it's nitpicking. But if we're not putting hands in the power of Black folks and folks of color, that's not racial justice. And this wasn't that.
And so with that piece, Davon, I will be because we got a few more minutes with you, and we gotta soak everything out of you, Davon. Not everything, but enough. This push and pull, if you will, with the Democratic Party, and then this push and pull with those within the party who I believe are either allies or at least close enough to us. There were some instances, we don't have to say names of folks who wanted to go a little further for us, but felt that they just couldn't, felt their careers may be sacrificed, felt it was too much of a risk. What is it that we can do, if anything, to show up people, to make it where not only can we keep them straight, keep their back straight within there, but also flex enough muscle to the leadership, in the sense of them understand that there's a price that potentially could be paid for them not continuing to push in the way that we feel. And if we're not at that point where we can do that, Davon, then from your perspective, how can we get there?
So I'm gonna start at the end. And I feel like LBS is in a position to say this, given, we're not a nonprofit, so there's certain things that don't apply to us. What's really important is that America is a plantation. Maryland is a plantation. How people eat determines the limits of their politics. And people who are in elected office, what we don't have in the state of Maryland is an independent electoral infrastructure that Black people, particularly working class Black people, own, control, and operate, such that we can put forward candidates for public office. So what we're having to interface with, and this may step on some toes, we're dealing mostly, there with a few exceptions, of course, a few notable exceptions, we're dealing mostly with glorified customer service representatives of corporate power, right? And so when you know that, there's a way that you just have to interact with people like that, right? They have limitations as to how far they can go based on the fact that they don't have an infrastructure that independently supports them. And that's one of the things that, eventually we and others hope to build, something that can provide that backing so that folks aren't having to worry about that. I think the best that can be done is for people to mobilize to go after elected officials who wouldn't go far enough. And I will say some names. I'll say Jeff Wallstrecker. That's a person that is going to need to be pushed, right? As an example. And we're going to need to organize to go after elected officials who are either slow to the draw or folks that oppose what we're trying to do, that's really the place that we're going to have progress. And because otherwise we should just expect that some people just going to have limits to how far they can go. And I've learned to respect that. I've learned to understand that people have to eat and people have limitations. That don't mean we don't push. That just means we clear about what's at stake. But we have to build that independent infrastructure if we want to really move things beyond where the Democratic Party establishment has constrained things.
All right. We got about 3 more minutes here with Davon and his analysis summation of leaderboard. Davon, towards the end, we're going to get deeper in terms of next steps. But if you can just give us a summation just on the leaderboard piece, if you will, where you see next steps, just in a general sense, going into next year's legislative session and beyond. And then we're going to come back to this for our 5 points as a whole towards the end. But we got about 2.5 minutes left here in your section.
So 2 things. One, as you mentioned earlier, we got to clean up some of the discrepancies. So the CRB in Baltimore, CRB in Prince George's County. So that cleanup work is going to need to happen. And then secondly, continue to fight for jurisdictions to establish independent oversight bodies that have power. I mean, for me, that's the next step in terms of what we got to do.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you, Davon. Appreciate you so much. Davon Love, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, for taking us through LEOBR, Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, and the repeal that legally, legislatively took place, but that we know is still an ongoing fight and an ongoing struggle. So thank you there, Davon. Thank you to all the attendees for the question that you all put forth. Moving right along here, we're going to move up next. I hope everybody is well. If you got to take a break, you know what to do. Go ahead, get your break in, get your juice, your water, your sandwich, however you do it. But we're going to keep on pressing on here. Up next, we have Monisha. Monisha, I'm going to say, if it's okay with you, Miss Monisha, because I am not going to unconsciously mispronounce your last name. She comes to us from the Public Justice Center. She's an attorney at the Public Justice Center, and she helped to launch the Maryland Suspension Representation Project that has been advocating for public school students for years. As we mentioned earlier, even though we weren't able to get it in this past session, I mean get it meaning get a bill passed that would have removed or seriously curtailed law enforcement in our public schools. This is an ongoing push that we're going to continue to make as a coalition. Monisha is going to discuss what happened with efforts to remove police officers out of our schools. She couldn't be here with us today, but we have a video already prepped in. So there's a video that's coming forth with our attorney, colleague, and comrade Monisha from the Public Justice Center. So if we got the video up, let's let it roll for our audience. Okay, I'm gonna check in with Sister Yannette, who's at the controls.
I think we're gonna save the SR. We're gonna save the video towards the end, so I'll go ahead and give the update about the MPIA.
All right. And before Yannette gives the update on the MPIA, I have to say a few words about Yannette. Personally, very deeply appreciative for her labor, for her love, her sacrifice, and just her steadfastness in keeping us up to speed and up to snuff. I cannot tell you how invaluable she has been to me personally, but to this coalition as a whole, and each and every one of you know it. So Yannette, we thank you and we love you and we appreciate you. Big movement hug for all that you have given and all that you're going to continue to give. Okay.
Thank you for that very warm introduction, Jonathan. So I won't be too long. This is less complicated than the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. And so Anton's Law is a bill that we would consider one of the bills that passed out the strongest out of the 5 demands. This is a piece of legislation that advocates, communities, impacted family members have been coming down to Annapolis and advocating for nearly a decade at this point. And the reason why this was one of the top priorities is because we understand that transparency is a prerequisite to accountability and building that that community trust. And up until this bill goes into effect, communities have had no real transparency over how police departments are investigating misconduct complaints, or actual victims and families of police violence who have filed complaints themselves had no way of finding out how their investigations were handled. So for a lot of reasons, this was a top priority, both for the ACLU for a long time, but also a lot of our partners here on this call and in this coalition. And so this bill is named after Anton Black, who was tragically killed by an officer in Greensboro, Maryland, back in 2018, after a police chief falsified records to hire an officer who actually had a proven record of misconduct. And we've seen time and time again instances where it comes out during a criminal investigation or a trial that an officer who has either who has actually killed an individual or denied them of civil liberties have actually had a history of previous police misconduct records that were just swept under the rug. So this bill was really critical in giving communities and impacted families that transparency over exactly how these departments are handling these investigations. So we went into session and our demand was clear. We wanted access to all investigations into police misconduct in all categories, whether it was someone racially profiling an individual or using excessive force. We wanted access to all the categories, regardless of whether or not a complaint was sustained or unsustained. Most because we understand that 90% of complaints that are made by the public are unsustained. So it's really critical that we have access to those unsustained complaints. And ultimately, thanks to the advocacy of everyone here on this call, we were successfully able to pass Anton's Law, which now moves police misconduct records from the may not disclose category to the may disclose category. So now individuals are able to make that request. Individuals are able to find out how their complaints have been handled. And this bill goes into effect October 2021. The only downside is, as Davon mentioned earlier, the HB 670 does not go into effect until July 2022. So with that bill, it prohibits law enforcement officers from expunging their misconduct records. And because that bill doesn't go into effect until next July, police departments right now could very well be, and we should expect them to be, expunging records. So that's something that we're definitely going to have to be monitoring to the best that we can, and being mindful of that. That is something that is happening right now. And again, this bill does go into effect October 2021. And I think we'll save questions for the sake of time towards the end, but if you drop some questions in the chat, I'll make sure to get to them.
Okay. All right. So we're going to save questions towards the end. I saw a burning question there from Gus Griffin out of Prince George's County, but we'll hold them towards the end. All right. We're moving right along here. Now we're going to go to our focus on use of force, and we got Joe Spielberger from the ACLU, who's going to go directly into what we were able to achieve legislatively in curtailing use of force here in the state of Maryland. So Joe, thank you very much there, you proud civil libertarian you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening, everyone. It's really an honor to be here with all of you and sharing about our accomplishments this session with regard to use of force. So our main goals for our use of force bill were to raise the legal standard from objectively reasonable to necessary based on the totality of the circumstances, because what has been the status quo up until this point has been much too low of a bar. We wanted to have very clear definitions of these terms and other terms, including, for instance, lethal force, because officers and the public need to understand that certain tactics like chokeholds and other tactics that restrict blood and oxygen flow are in and of themselves a threat to people's lives. And we wanted to make sure that there's an explicit civil right of action, because families of those who have been killed or abused by police need to have the ability to seek justice for themselves and recover for injuries and loss of life. So those were our main goals for the bill. We were successful in the House and got most of our language amended into the Speaker's bill. Unfortunately, the Senate chose to strip that language and instead amended much weaker language onto SB 71. And this is the language that ended up passing. So under SB 71, we did raise the legal standard to authorize force only when it's necessary and proportional based on the totality of the circumstances. Officers also must stop using force as soon as the situation is under control, there's no longer an imminent threat, or when force will no longer accomplish a legitimate law enforcement objective. There are new requirements for officers to take steps to de-escalate, intervene, obtain appropriate medical assistance, and document all use of force incidents. Supervisors must respond to the scene when officers use force that causes serious physical injury and review all the video recordings of the incident. There are new training requirements that officers need to complete, and officers can now face additional criminal penalties if they intentionally use force that results in serious physical injury. The use statute in S. And if we go to the next slide. So the code for this bill regards these statutes in mind, it is certain to recognize that Maryland does have a statute, and a lot of so until now we were very few without one, so it brings Maryland in line with the rest of the country, and we no longer rely solely on Supreme Court case law, which has been adequate. Also, sort of emphasizing that legal state is necessary and that only other states, California and Vermont, have been able to accomplish thus far that significant accomplishment.
Okay, so while Joe is coming back, I want to go to a question, Yannette, real quick, if it's okay with you, real quick from Gus Griffin out of Prince George's County. I find this question is very pertinent, and of course, I'm a little biased. Please forgive me. This is coming from Gus. Joe, real quick, give us 1 minute here. Gus was stating that it's been revealed that the state's attorney in Prince George's County has a list of officers who have been deemed unreliable to testify in trials called a Brady list. And there's been a lot said about this. What, if anything, from your perspective, Yannette, could Anton's law as passed do about potentially revealing that list to the public?
Well, since she is a custodian of those records, and if the reason that they're on that list is because of previous misconduct, I don't see why they shouldn't be able to request that from her office, as long as it's not interrupting an ongoing investigation or any of the categories as to why a custodian might be denied access to that record. But that's something I want to double check with our legal team. But that's a really great question that I'm going to follow up with you. But I would assume so, but let me double check.
Thank you, Yannette. All right, Joe, you back with us?
I hope so. Can you all hear me?
You sound better, Joe.
Okay, I apologize for that. Having same internet problems over here. I appreciate your patience. So,
starting to sound a little jabby again now, though.
The issues that
Oh, okay, Joe, we're gonna have to try to log back in one more time, Joe. You just froze on us this time. While Joe is working on his connection there, he seems to be moving now. His face is moving. Try to talk one more time, Joe. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me? Is this coming through all right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry again. So I'm not sure where I exactly cut off, but real quickly, some of the issues that we had with this bill are, one, striking the clear definitions makes this bill much less clear, both to the public and officers. We certainly want to be clear that we're holding officers to a higher standard and making them more accountable. And we also want to use this bill as a tool to get officers to change their behavior over time. So for officers who are trying to do the right thing, this bill should have provided better notice so that they have the tools and knowledge at their disposal to be able to do their jobs properly. Second, there were some concerns about language authorizing the use of force only to control situations and achieve legitimate law enforcement objectives. There are certainly situations where a police department or a court would find that force is necessary to accomplish a legitimate, what is seen as a legitimate law enforcement objective, but where we still don't want officers using force. And a good example of that is interacting with people exhibiting mental health or behavioral health crises. You know, if they're not other using those situations. Without a action, it means that families don't have a clear path to seek and for loss of land.
Hey, Joe.
And
if you can go ahead and just cut your video off, that might help. Just to go ahead and finish just the content part. I think if you cut your video off, you may have enough bandwidth.
Okay, let me try that. Lastly, I was just going to say really quickly with regard to criminal penalties, we know that it's rare that officers are criminally charged. There's certainly disagreement between members and organizations within the coalition. A lot of folks are very opposed to criminal penalties, specifically because of the disproportionate impact that they have on Black and brown officers. But by limiting criminal exposure only to officers who intentionally use excessive force, it makes it even less likely that officers will be held accountable criminally anyways. So in terms of moving forward, next steps, if and when an officer is criminally charged, we'll have to see how courts interpret some of this language, which would provide more guidance and clarification. But most importantly, we'll be monitoring the response of police unions and seeing how local law enforcement agencies issue new guidance for their officers. So I know there are folks on this call who have already been discussing this in Montgomery. The Montgomery FOE recently filed a suit against me over the low use of force, and there's concern about to what the gun department is with county use of force. An example of a restriction be moving forward while we do.
All right, Joe, we're going to go ahead and just move to questions. We're going to go ahead and stop it right there. I think we probably have done the best that we can with the bandwidth that you have there. Let's move to some questions, Joe. See if there are any questions on the excessive use of force. I'm just scanning real quick the questions that I have. I see a Jerry here. Jerry asked, with use of force language in law ambiguous, who will clarify specifics? Case law, local jurisdiction. So who's gonna clarify the specifics? This is Jerry talking in terms of use of force. Is this the case? Is case law, local jurisdictions?
Yeah, it could certainly be both. Moving forward, when officers are charged, that will provide more guidance, and we'll have to see what opportunities there are when and local department at the local level and offer consent.
Okay. Well, want to thank you there, Joe, for your presentation. You want to thank you there, Joe. I think we've probably done the best we can with the bandwidth that you have. So we appreciate you. If you have anything written that you, from what you stated today, if you got something prepared that's written that you can drop in the chat for folks to take with them, or I know it'll already be submitted on the ACLU website and on the Maryland Coalition website. We'll make sure that folks on this call have access to the specifics and particulars that you presented here today. Let's follow up on the use of excessive force. And Yannette, if there's anything you want to add to what Joe stated that you think may not have been reiterated right now, is there anything you want to add, Yannette?
No, not at this moment.
Okay. All right. We're pressing forward here. Looks like we're all doing well. Everybody's doing good. So we're coming down the home stretch. We're going into local control. Okay. And Yannette, before I go into local control, we're going to save the video for last on the SROs. Okay. You already stated that.
Yeah,
Okay.
the video will play after this.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. So local control. This is focusing on Baltimore City. Specific to the police department there, we have Molly Amster with us to take us through what took place with Baltimore City and what this means for Baltimore City going forward. So Molly, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. So the score that we gave local control for this year was an incomplete. It was a great first step forward, which is something that we've been unsuccessful in getting in previous years. But essentially what this bill does is it creates an advisory board, which will weigh in on the issue of returning local control back to the Baltimore City Police Department. And that body will be made up of 5 or 6 elected officials or their representatives, the police commissioner, and a couple of police union members, as well as a member of the Civilian Review Board, and then 3 community members who are appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the city council, and 3 experts on the justice system, police reform, and community policing, who similarly will be appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the city council. And the things that they're supposed to be weighing in on are here on this slide. These are some of the things that have continued to come up over the years in our advocacy. I think for the actual implementation of local control, one of the biggest questions that needs to be reconciled and a conclusion needs to be reached that everyone agrees with is this final question here, number 6 on the slide, which is what parts of the city charter need to be amended in order to restore local control to Baltimore. Some people say nothing in the charter needs to be amended. Some people say it's Article 2, other people say it's Article 4, some people say it's both. And so we do need some time to figure that out. One of the challenges with our advocacy, or something that we're going to really have to be diligent about over the next year or more, is the timing of this advisory board completing its report. That final report is due, as you can see on the slide, after the general election in 2022. So if we want to, at the conclusion of the advisory board's process, the report, they will then, presumably the city council will pass legislation to put a ballot measure on the ballot to ask the people of Baltimore if they would like to restore local control to Baltimore City. This is not something that is necessary, to do in order to make this happen, but is something that the mayor and the General Assembly, in particular the Baltimore City delegation, wanted in order to get buy-in from Baltimore City. They wanted residents to reclaim control themselves. Wasn't something that we were expecting, but it was the compromise that we were able to move forward. And so that ballot measure would need to be really moved through the summer before the general election. So that would be next summer of 2022, many months before the December 1st, 2022 deadline for this report. So we're going to have to be really vigilant in advocating for a speedy process that gets the board appointed, has them meeting regularly, has a report done really probably by June of next year, so that we can in fact get this on the ballot in 22. After a ballot measure passes, we would then likely need to see further action at the from the General Assembly to enact local control. So it's a multi-step process. This is the first one. We're really pleased that we were able to move the ball forward, but we've not yet achieved local control, and that's why we've determined that the grade for this issue is incomplete.
And I just want to give a correction or even a quasi apology for not telling you all who Molly Amster is. She is the director of Jews United for Justice. She's very humble, I can tell, but we're still gonna make the correction. Molly is the director of Jews United for Justice for the Baltimore branch, and she also runs Baltimore's Jeremiah Fellowship, which manages partner relationships and coalitions and works with staff and leaders to raise funds needed to support the work in the charmed city. All right, we appreciate you, Molly, for all that you give. So if there's any questions for Molly specific to the bill to restore autonomy at the Baltimore City Police Department to the city of Baltimore, I'm looking right now to see if there's any questions. I don't see any direct questions on that. So Molly, we thank you. And as you know, we're going to be continuing to lean on you. Appreciate you for all you give. Yannette, so we're ready to bring guests. This is the video we were going to show earlier, Monisha from the Public Justice Center on our work this session on removal of SROs and where we go from here on that issue. Thank you. All right, we need to hear the volume. Might want to stop the video till the volume's up.
Hello.
You're all set to go.
Oh, okay. So I'm controlling it. Okay. Let me, okay. Oh, I'm not controlling it. Someone else is. Okay.
I'm Monisha Chiryle with the Public Justice Center. I'm so sorry I can't be with everyone tonight, but I did want to share brief updates on the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability's fifth demand from this legislative session. And that demand was to get police out of our public schools and reinvest in interventions that actually support positive student behavior and peaceful conflict resolution. We included this demand because we know that many of the excesses and injustices of policing that we see in our communities are mirrored in what happens with police in our schools. When we put police in our schools, we end up criminalizing children for acting like children, for being disruptive or getting into those schoolyard fights. These are the bases for the vast majority of arrests in our schools. And the burden of this overcriminalization falls primarily on Black students, who are more likely to attend schools with officers and who have been shown to face arrest even when they engage in the same behaviors as their white peers. The burden also falls disproportionately on students with disabilities, who we've seen sometimes face handcuffing, get arrested for behaviors related to their disabilities. We also know that police presence in schools does not make schools safer. The data is very clear that having an officer on campus doesn't stop school shootings or reduce any school-based violence at all. Our strategy for the 2021 session involved two House bills, neither of which had been introduced before. First, House Bill 496, which would have completely redirected the current $10 million per year state SRO fund, SRO meaning school police, to student mental health services, wraparound supports, and restorative justice, all of which have been shown to actually make schools more safe. And second, House Bill 1089, which included that same complete funding shift, as well as a full state-level prohibition on police being stationed in schools at all. And that, of course, is our ultimate goal. We had great hearings on both bills. Students, parents, teachers, administrators, mental health professionals from around the state spoke about how police presence in schools harms and endangers kids, and about how supportive interventions more effectively promote a safer school culture. We talked to a number of committee members in the committees handling the bills, Ways and Means on the House side, and Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs on the Senate side. They were supportive of both or at least one bill. Ultimately, however, Ways and Means committee leadership opted to move a third bill, House Bill 522. Now, HB 522 simply states that SROs shouldn't be involved in student discipline, and it imposes some additional training, selection, planning, and supervision requirements around schools' use of on-site police. The problem is that the largest districts, and at least half of school districts overall, already have adopted the prohibition on school police being involved in discipline. And yet they continue to see challenges and harms associated with school policing. Likewise, expanded training, supervision, and planning has been shown to be inadequate. The concern with school police isn't really about bad people or bad training. It's a model that just doesn't fit the education setting, because by design, it uses law enforcement to respond to the behaviors that kids engage in because their brains are still developing and they're figuring out how to resolve conflict and handle their emotions. A school police officer's job is to view and respond to conduct through the lens of the criminal code. And that's not a job we can change through training or supervision. And in fact, that kind of training and supervision is already happening under existing law. The fundamental change we need is to just remove this job from our schools altogether. We ultimately opposed House Bill 522 on the Senate side, where it was duly assigned to both EHE and JPR. And in the end, the bill never got out of committee on the Senate side. So where that leaves us is that we've got to come back next year and build on all the tremendous education that we've done. The school police committee within this larger MCJPA coalition is still working out exactly what that looks like. But at a minimum, we're hoping to reintroduce the funding shift bill 496 for its second year. We're also talking through whether we might want to put together and support a package of bills on juvenile justice, decriminalizing low-level offenses for youth, and preventing youth from being kicked out of school for unrelated arrests in the community. The idea would be to really attack some of the issues with school policing from multiple angles at once. I'll be sure to keep you all posted as things develop, and we'll let you know about opportunities to engage, because I'm hoping that just as we did last year, we can really come together and throw our people power behind some of the changes we really need to see at the intersection of policing and schools. We'll also be spending the off session doing as much as education as we can on the topic, and supporting local efforts in Montgomery County, Howard County, Prince George's County, and beyond to get police out of schools at the school board level or at the county council level. So if there's a group that you want us to talk to and educate, please be in touch. We know there's a lot of misunderstanding around the true role that school police play. So we want to have open conversations with community members and really meet people where they are. Again, I wish I could be there tonight to answer questions, but since I'm not, please do feel free to contact me directly if you have any. I'm sure Yannette or someone else can put my email in the chat. And best wishes to everybody. I look forward to continuing this work together.
All right, we're definitely appreciative for Monisha from the Public Justice Center. And I see a question from Ellen out of Frederick County. And this question can be directed to you, Ned or Kat. But Ellen states, SROs in Frederick County are viewed favorably. And in fact, today the local newspaper shows an SRO giving a white child a big welcome back to school with a hug. There is great disparity in how SROs are seen in Maryland. What are the steps to address this?
Take that one. I think Monisha just covered it. It's going to take a lot of public education. For a lot of folks, it's even though SROs haven't been around for too long, it's become difficult to imagine a world where police officers aren't in our schools, despite all the data that shows that having police presence in our schools actually leads to more arrests for, like Monisha already mentioned, things that normal kids do. So it's going to take just a lot of public education, really targeting your school board members, your local legislators, and educating them, and reaching out to those who have already been affected in Frederick by having police officers in the schools already, and really building that strong local organizing game so that we are, I think we're going to see wins on the local level before we get it to the state level. And I think that the more we organize on the local level will help the efforts on the state level. So that's going to be an important critical next step.
All right. And then we have a question here from Dorothy Elliott. We love you, Dorothy. The mother of Archie Elliott, still pushing forward, still fighting, still organizing. Her question, are there any schools where SROs have been removed? If so, what specific improvements? I can't see your whole question there, Dorothy. Maybe I need to blow my chat up. Excuse me. Sorry, family. It just didn't come through. Okay. I'm sorry. Are there any schools where SROs have been removed? If so, what specific improvements have been noted?
That is a fantastic question.
Yeah, I can jump in a little.
Perfect.
Monisha really is the expert, and I'm sure she can give you tons of data. Off the top of my head, I know that there have been several school districts, a lot and localities, not any full states that I know of, but several localities, including Minneapolis, Portland, Denver, Seattle, have all voted to phase out SROs. And a lot of these reforms have come pretty recently. So I think we're still waiting on a lot of the data. But all of the data that we have right now supports that the fact that SROs are ultimately more harmful. And so, again, I know Monisha is the expert here. I'm going to make sure that we follow up with all of the research that's been collected in preparation for moving the bills forward.
And Kat, if we can just drop the link to the questions chat for any of the questions that we might not get to this evening, we'll make sure we follow up if you submit your question in that form.
And lastly, getting next to last, Gus Griffin makes a comment that Kat or Yanette or whoever feels more prepared to answer this in terms of the racial demographic of this. And Gus makes a comment that would suggest that the SROs may not be as much of a problem in Frederick County as it is in counties like Prince George's or in a city like Baltimore City. What does the data state in terms of the impact of SROs within a certain demographic?
I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but when I last looked at the numbers from 2018 to 2019, the majority of arrests were actually coming from Prince George's County. I think that year Prince George's County had 530 arrests, which over at least 90% being of Black and brown kids, mostly Black kids. Similar in places like Montgomery County, I think it's less than 10%, but of that 50% is Black. I have to double check those numbers with Monisha, but we have seen that in jurisdictions where we've seen more of this being a problem in jurisdictions where they have a lot more children of color in those schools.
Okay, then we have Jerry here. I don't know what county Jerry's from Montgomery County. Okay, so Jerry is stating that in Montgomery County, they have moved legislatively to replace school resource officers with community resource officers. What do we know in terms of the difference or distinction there?
This is another great question. I think there might be some of our members from Montgomery County that can respond to this in the chat as well. But to my understanding, what the efforts are happening in Montgomery County right now, they're technically removing them out of schools, but they'd be right outside the building. So it's not really really removing them off of the property. They would still be able to come in at any time and still enforce what they've been already doing in criminalizing Black children. So we don't really see that as a solution to the problem, but kind of way to tinker around the edges.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I think that just about does it in terms of, I see Stephen here. I think Stephen has a question in terms of potentially removing principals who rely on the police to discipline. Is that what are you asking what our position is on that, Stephen? I'm not sure we have a position on that. But we were definitely great photos there of us on the move there in Annapolis. That's why I love to see that street heat. I'm sorry, I'm off task now. Okay, so I think we just about covered it for school resource officers. And in the chat, if someone would be so kind of put the research, one of the things I've always loved the ACLU for those of you that don't know, that was my first nonprofit job out of undergrad a little over 20 years ago. When I was 22 years old in 1999, I worked for the ACLU of the National Capital Area. We can drop that research in the chat on the SROs, the research that ACLU has done across the country on this, showing some trends and which will inform our discussion and our strategize and our work going forward, okay? Moving right along here, thank you so much, y'all, for hanging in here. We were coming towards the end, but towards the best, the absolute best, because as I was speaking to earlier, in terms of what I've seen take place here in the state of Maryland, is our coalition becoming broader, becoming deeper, and stretching out from across the entire state. I see there was a question here. One person asking in terms of our representation on the Eastern Shore. Yes, we do have representation within this coalition on the Eastern Shore, the Western Maryland, Middle, and all in between. Of course, Anton's law coming directly out of the struggle on the Eastern Shore. But one of the developments that we have seen in the spirit of mothers like Marion, mothers like Dorothy, is what we have seen is the most directly impacted families turning their pain into power in terms of representing and not only fighting for themselves and their loved ones, but then becoming fighters and advocates in this movement as a whole. Many of you have seen some of the tension, the constructive tension that's taking place nationally on this question of who speaks for us. You know, the mother of Tamir Rice and others have raised this question direct and constructive. And I believe it comes in the spirit of mothers like Marion and Dorothy, who before this posse came into being, and Marion being a leader that's brought a posse together, mothers across the country, mostly mothers, the Coalition of Concerned Mothers, which she serves as executive director of, as a model of this contingency and this constituency, then become the leaders and the voice of our movement. It is beyond inspirational. And so we want to bring to the fore several members from this posse who have come to the fore and to the forefront. And so I want to bring them up into a panel discussion. We're going to have a panel discussion to discuss some of the challenges and some of the issues what we've been able to achieve here from their perspective and where they see the movement going forward. And so number one, we have Dawn Dalton. I've had a chance to meet Dawn and work with her, and assist her, if you will, over the last year. Dawn with community justice and also the Just Us initiative, which she has launched. We also have Carlene Ponder from the Silver Spring Justice Coalition. Marion Gray Hopkins. You've heard me say her name ad nauseum throughout this evening. Marion Gray Hopkins, who was on the board of the state Maryland ACLU here. Darlene Kane, Mothers on the Move, out of Baltimore City. And I believe, do we have Tawanda Jones with us tonight? Is Tawanda Jones with us, the sister of Tyrone West Wednesdays? If she's on, then she'll be on. But if not, then we can hear her. If you heard Tawanda before, you know how she brings it. So with this panel discussion, question and answer discussion, I'll go ahead and kick it off. I'll serve as a quasi moderator if everyone has their microphones on. But I want to go ahead and put a question to Marion to kick us off here. Marion, you know, I've known you, Marion, since my foundational youth, as they would say in the streets, since I was a youngin'. And I think I'm still kind of young. But Marion, give us a sense of how you've seen this development, how it's developed over the years. I remember when, you know, mothers, if I can just be forthright, the way it was treated in the movement is that it was almost like mothers would be treated like trophies almost for, you know, some of the old guard civil rights activists. I don't want to criticize them. I'm just giving my assessment of how I saw it. And now to see the assertiveness and the asserting of rightful place and rightful position in the movement. Marion, how do you characterize this? How have you seen this in the years and decades going forward, and where do you see it going from here?
Yeah, Jonathan, I just want to make a note here. I see on the presentation they have me as the sister of Tyrone West, and I'm actually the mother of Gary Hopkins Jr., who was murdered.
Absolutely.
Who was murdered by the police in Prince George's County in November of 1999. I think, Jonathan, you said it well at the beginning and opening up this session, in that things look a lot different now than they did back then. We didn't have all of the different coalitions that we have now that have stood up and for what's right and to stand up for change. I don't often like to say justice, because there is no justice when you lose a loved one and that loved one is not coming back. So I think that these coalitions have pulled together what we're seeing as bringing more accountability and more transparency and building something that can create preventative measures so that we don't have to fight going forward. I am just happy to see that the diversity that we have, young, old, white, black, LGBTQ. I mean, it's just a beautiful thing to look out upon all of those that have come on board, that are part of these 100+ organizations and more. I mean, people come out that are not part of the organizations that represent MCJPA. And I think that because we have become more diverse and we are doing things differently. In the past, we went before them and asked them for things. What we're seeing now is that we're demanding. And I think that demanding and standing behind what we are demanding is some of the things that have created the change that we're seeing. And Jonathan, I also like something that you said earlier. You said earlier, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't you, Jonathan. It was actually Davon had said something earlier. And or you, I don't know, I can't remember, but we are to acknowledge and not actually celebrate the change, because there is in fact so much work to do. And what do we do going forward? We continue to organize, we continue to mobilize, and we continue to build the families, because I think it makes a huge difference when those are impacted or standing on the front and being held up, if you will, by those that are part of the coalitions of organizations. So our work continues, and we're passing the baton on. We're getting older. Dorothy Elliott and I have been out there on the front line. Dorothy since 1993, me since 2000, although Gary was murdered in 1999. So it's going to be important that we bring more families on, because we are the brunt of what has happened here, and we should be the brunt of any change that comes forward.
Absolutely, Marion. We thank you and we love you for your steadfastness and the consistency, the consistent consistency and dedication, which has inspired. You know, the more you struggle, the more you know, the more you can do it. And you and Dorothy have definitely been just a consistent example of that. I want to bring Sister Tawanda Jones, who's also been a consistent example of that. I don't know if she's on the line with us tonight. Sister Tawana, you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Sister Tawana Jones, West Wednesdays. That heat you bring, we feel it down here in Southern Prince George's County, no question about it. And Bill Blige, your comrade up there, keeps us posted in terms of West Wednesdays. There's been some recent news I've seen, Tawana, in terms of the potential impact that what's been happening nationally may be happening in your brother's case. And so we want to hear, is it in terms of a potential impact that may be happening in terms of potentially bringing those officers to justice? And if not, what we do to continue to help empower what you've been able to do each and every week, West Wednesdays. Definitely love you and put our arms around you.
Thank you, guys. I love you guys too. First of all, I want to apologize for being so late. But as life would have it, you go through sadness. And right now it's a real sad time for me and my family. My grandmother just passed away on yesterday. So it's a lot going on. It's a whole lot. But nevertheless, as far as West Wednesday, we've been out here now going on 8 years. Like literally this week, tomorrow will be 409 weeks, like nonstop fighting and trying to hold these killer cops accountable, not just for my brother, but for all the victims of police brutality and murder. And pretty much what's going on is, it's unfortunately that it's not just the police department that lie and play games and take a family through a nightmare. You have to worry about all these other industries that work together. And it's really sad. And the fact that the medical examiner's office played a crucial role in why me and my family did not get accountability, because they lied for the killer cops. It was to the point I literally had to, so once they lied, it took them 154 days to give my family a partial autopsy report. And immediately I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna start grinding, putting in extra hours at work, doing whatever I need to do, because my brother will have the last say so. And I thank God that I had to literally go in my pocket and get $50,000 to have my brother's body exhumed and for the truth to come out. But nevertheless, David Fowler, he lied. Like, he literally lied to get the police officers. And right now he's in hot water because he actually had the nerve to go into George Floyd on the stand and say the same exact thing about what he said about my brother and what he said about Antoine Black. The list goes on all the corruption, and it's just really sad. So right now we're working on reopening my brother's case. You know, thank God that the Attorney General is pretty much going to look into all of the the cases that he was involved in, all the in custody deaths starting from, I think it's 2011 on up. And everybody know my brother was murdered in 2013. So definitely trying to push getting my brother's case open along with these other cases. And that's the biggest thing. They need to reopen these cases pretty much. So, yeah.
Well, thank you again. I mean, I mean, not that you want to be thanked, but we are thanking you and putting on just for the inspiration that you give us and got our arms around you and your family right now in terms of the transition of your grandmother. We know that the struggle is eternal, the struggle is real, and the struggle is ongoing, both personal and political. But we thank you for always just rising to the occasion, even in the midst of your just consistent pain, and always turning it into power, Sister Tawana. So we're gonna keep a close eye on that situation with you. You inform us and let us know what we can do across the state to bring whatever power and juice we can from the front lines to ensure that we finally get justice for Tyrone Rest. Peace be upon his name. Want to bring in Sister Dawn Dalton here, Prince George's County Just Us Initiative and Community Justice, a strong posse of women, mothers, sisters that are definitely on the move. Dawn, this legislative session, you were out there out front, and you didn't leave no stone unturned in terms of how you brought the energy on these politicians. Dawn, give us a sense from your perspective, if you will, because one of the things I've always appreciated about you, Dawn, is you bring a real, in other words, you're not, Frederick Douglass in the Politics of Reform said years ago that in this struggle is either going to be with words, with blows, or with both. So your words at times felt like some good blows, I'll be honest with you, because you leave no stone unturned. in terms of that energy of accountability, Don, in terms of holding these politicians accountable, give us a sense of from your perspective of our strategy going forward and what you learned potentially through this process.
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for having me. It was actually an honor to be a part of the team. And I got one incredible education, to be completely honest. The shock of my life, again, I went in as a directly impacted mother. Luckily, my son was not murdered at the hands of the police, but his life and the lives of my family were flipped upside down. The trauma was what led me to this space and made me be determined to continue to fight for other families who found themselves in a situation similar to mine. I was disgusted through a lot of this process. It was, like I said before, the education of my lifetime. I think Zoom was the ultimate gift for me in this legislative session, because I say it all the time. I have, through Yonette, gone to Annapolis, I would say 2 years in a row, where my son was actually testifying on different bills. And you're not up close and personal with the legislators. You're in the same room, but they're far back. But through Zoom, you're up close and personal. So you get to actually see their facial expressions, whether or not they're paying attention. You get to hear the questions that they're asking, and you can kind of tell what side of the coin they're actually on, just based upon the types of questions that they're asking. I was extremely disappointed in the senator from Prince George's County, Michael Jackson, because he literally went into this legislative session to pretty much deny us of what we were fighting so hard for. And I think the crazy thing to me is that we're simply fighting for justice. We're not asking for anything that we as community members don't deserve. And in fact, you're fighting against us. You really came to Annapolis to take on the task of the FOP to not protect the citizens of Prince George's County. So, Prince George's County and actually the state of Maryland, let me just say it that way. I was disgusted, I can honestly say at times, to see mothers like Marion, to see mothers like Dorothy Elliott that have fought for so many years for justice for their sons, and to see mothers and family members that have gone year after year in front of legislators and relived the trauma that they've dealt with for years, just for someone to see the humanity in their loved one and to give them justice, just to put laws in place that protect us as a people, and to see legislators just turn a blind eye to justice for political gain. You literally put profit and gain over people, over life. So that was disheartening to me. I did find joy in working with the team. What I did learn is there is a lot of power in the people. We had some very, very strong family members going up to Annapolis, rallying, testifying on Zoom. There's one night we were on Zoom testifying before the House until 12:30 in the morning. So we definitely saw different strategic moves by our legislators to kind of like wear us down and wear us out. And we were worn down and we were wore out. But what I love is that we hung in there. We ran the course, and no, we did not get everything we wanted. But for an average person like myself, I learned a lot. And all you did was really make me angry and make me be determined to fight. So, that's my spill on everything. It was an education, and I'm determined to move harder and stronger and pay attention to what's going on in the future and fight even harder. In 2022, we need to start, electing the right people and putting people in position that really care about the people. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Dawn. I told you she don't mince words. I told you. She brings it, and we appreciate you, Dawn. Thank you so very much. Not that you're here to be thanked, but we love you and we thank you for all that you bring. Carlene Ponder from the Silver Spring Justice Coalition. Yannette has informed me we have a video in the queue from Sister Carlene. So we got that video here. Okay.
because it's not if another Black person will be killed by the police, it's when. And I don't want it to be my son.
For 4 or 5 years now, we've been trying to repeal this law. And we're close to repeal. But our own senators, Jeff Waldstreicher and Will Smith in Montgomery County, are keeping us from justice. Because they're voting
Is
to
the
weaken
video
this
being
bill.
loaded?
We gotta let Waldstreicher and Smith know we're not falling for the okie doke. What they're doing, I said the other day, I said, it felt like I was so hopeful this go round because again, we are organized and there's so many of us. And for them to put this legislation out in the manner that they did was like a sucker punch. It was. And we don't speak up. These killings will continue. 21,000 deaths. Shame on Senator Smith and Waldstreicher. Shame! Shame on Senator Smith and Waldstreicher. Shame!
All right, Carlin Pond. I hope I'm saying her first name correctly.
To members of the Maryland General Assembly.
Yes, you said it correctly.
On behalf of the sisters, mothers, and cousins of Black men killed by police in the state of Maryland, we resolutely condemn Senate President Bill
I can't
Ferguson.
actually see the video, so you all tell me. Did you see the videos? Okay, good. So there were two. One was a protest, and then the other was a statement
The
about.
second one is playing right now. It was
Oh,
Lorena, can we hit play? Okay.
To members of the Maryland General Assembly, on behalf of the sisters, mothers, and cousins of Black men killed by police in the state of Maryland, we resolutely condemn Senate President Bill Ferguson's hostile remarks toward the victims, their families, and community advocates. We gathered with the family members on Saturday, February 27, 2021, to call attention to the Senate Judicial Proceeding Committee's failure to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights and to meaningfully restrict police use of force despite their public claims to the contrary. Montgomery County Senators Smith and Waldstreicher introduced and or voted for weakening amendments. In a peaceful protest, we drove our cars on public streets past Senator Waldstreicher's home, honking horns and bearing signs on cars. We continued to Key Middle School and then into the neighborhood of Burnt Mills Hills near the home of Senator Smith. Senator Ferguson has called the protest an act of intimidation and alleged that we targeted the senator's family members. With his choice of words, Senator Ferguson has aligned himself with those who seek to vilify protests on behalf of Black lives. Sadly, our country has witnessed the great discrepancy between portrayals of white supremacist-led protests versus protests denouncing police brutality. The Maryland General Assembly is failing to protect Black lives and failing to forcefully turn the tide against legislation that cloaks police unaccountability. They are also attempting to quell democratic protests on behalf of Black and brown bodies. Senator Ferguson's attack on free speech on the Maryland Senate floor is significant because of the nation's history of using law enforcement to arrest, beat, and even kill civil rights protesters. Today, as in the past, these tactics continue. Our response to Senator Ferguson honors the work of those that came before us. In the words of civil rights leader and U.S. Congressman John Lewis, we do not want our freedom gradually. We want to be free now. We, the community, resolutely reject the dubious nature of Maryland General Assembly leaders who proclaim that Black Lives Matter while demanding that we shut up and not be heard. Sincerely, the Silver Spring Justice Coalition and the Montgomery County Defund Policing and Invest in Communities Coalition.
so thank you. It was funny from my perspective because I couldn't actually see or hear the videos, but I've seen them before.
So I'm just speaking from an activist perspective about, this past season. We had what we consider a very successful car rally in Montgomery County, targeting the leaders of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, Jeff Wallstreicher and Senator Will Smith, to get a lot of the changes that you all were talking about tonight, particularly with the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. We wanted a full repeal. We talked about that and how we got a lot more administrative process in some ways. And we wanted reform with the Maryland Public Information Act so that the records of officers who have a long history of brutalizing our community are no longer kept secret. So we're in an interesting place here in Silver Spring because in Montgomery County, because the leaders of Maryland General Assembly who hold key positions are people who we know, we've been in contact with throughout our existence as a coalition since 2018. They are people who have made promises to us about how progressive they will be in terms of getting the type of legislation that we all want to stop, our communities from being brutalized. But as has also been said earlier tonight, they don't necessarily go full stop. And as we saw, we had to put more pressure on Senator Smith and Wallstreicher this year. We did that by having the car rally and going through their neighborhoods. They were vocal, particularly Will Smith was very vocal about his dislike of the protest. The follow-up statement that I made was really out of great concern, because our legislators, our progressive legislators, were coming out and saying things about our protests that were, I think, things that are dangerous. I mean, calling us, threatening and, implying that we were somehow harming, their children and their families by protesting on behalf of people who are here tonight, people who've lost their children to police violence. And I was alarmed by their statements because anti-protest laws have gone up in state legislatures across the country. And those anti-protest laws are not targeting the types of folks who we saw, on the Capitol, raid the Capitol on January 6th, and people who actually caused serious harm to police officers. They're targeting people who look like those of us who are here speaking tonight on this panel. And they're targeting folks for protesting with some pretty severe penalties. If you followed the protesters in Colorado who were organizing on behalf of Elijah McClain, several of them were facing absolutely ludicrous charges, such as kidnapping, because they protested outside of a police station. And so the theory was that they had kidnapped the police officers inside the police station. I mean, just insane. But they came with, it was a threat of very heavy penalty, very heavy jail time. But some of those charges were dismissed, but nonetheless, those people had to wage quite a battle. They were in a fight for their lives because of the actions that state legislatures have taken across this country to criminalize protesting when it comes to saying that Black Lives Matter. So I was alarmed to hear that type of language from our leaders here in the Maryland General Assembly. And I don't think that they got a very strong response. I know that we were very busy, just trying to get the legislation passed, but I wanted to raise the issue because, who's to say that there won't be sleeper legislation, coming up this next session targeting the type of work that we do, which is, activism on behalf of, ourselves and our family members. So I just want to put that on everybody's radar to be aware of that, and that is a real threat and it is a possibility. And let's not, give our legislators a pass in thinking that they're too progressive to actually cause harm to any of us, their most vocal constituents. So that's what I wanted to share with you all tonight. Thank you.
And thank you, Carlene. We have a couple of questions for you. I just want to state, I was watching the protest live. Sister Zakia Sankar Jabbar out of Montgomery County Racial Justice Now, she was filming it live, leaning on the horn. And so she gave us, I put it on the Prince George's People's Coalition page. A couple questions that we had, Carlene. First, you may have already answered this, but what was the overall strategy behind the car?
To members of the Marion, I think it was to be.
It's a two-part question, Carlene. Wait a minute. So the overall strategy.
Resolutely condemn Senate President Bill.
Okay.
I am tired.
Wait. Someone cut the video off. Thank you. Okay. The overall strategy for the car rally, and in what ways did it achieve the goal, if in terms of the tactic and strategy going in based on that direct action?
So I think the overall strategy was to let our legislators know who we've been very cozy with. You know, it's a very weird thing when these are legislators who you have been meeting with, you know, for years, and who have been promising you that when they get the opportunity that they're going to, you know, meet all of our demands because they understand, you know, our pain. And they, you know, in the case of Will Smith, he knows the issues inside and out. I've had several conversations with him. So the problem when you're an activist and you have to counter folks who are in leadership, you are, you know, cozy with them. You know that they know the issues. I think they have the heart, right, to be on the right side of justice. But you also see that they're facing pressure from the FOP or, you know, other constituents who are not as part of the activist community. So we had to sort of ramp up our efforts. It wasn't enough just to meet for coffee anymore. And so, you know, that car protest was very, very public because it was in front of their neighbors. And I think that is part of the reason why we want to call it a success, because they responded, and they responded forcefully, not in a nasty way, right? In the sense that they felt the need to call us intimidating, threatening, etc. But they responded and they felt that heat. I don't know that they feel that heat when we're meeting them, you know, just in our condos and apartments and sitting down and just chit-chatting about the issues, and they get to say, I know, I understand. Because that's typically how it goes. This was a direct action.
And so based on that direct action, you mentioned John Lewis earlier, that good trouble, if you will, it definitely was good. It definitely was some trouble. How should the leadership's reaction to the car rally, which you just talked a little bit about, inform our strategy and tactics going forward? You know, there's always been this tension in terms of what I want to call the inside-outside strategy. And there's some of us that lean more outside, some that are definitely more inside, some that can do both. From your perspective, going forward, how does the results from your perspective inform us as a collective going forward?
So I think part of the reason why we got such a negative reaction from Wall Striker and Smith is because they know a lot of us in the Silver Spring Justice Coalition. You know, they're chummy with a lot of us. So it was being able to say we can have those relationships, but when it comes down to the business of protecting Black lives, that is ultimately our goal. We elected you, we will push you. And so I think it's, you know, part of the history, right, of, you know, the Democratic Party and getting so many people of color elected in positions, like, for example, in PG County, part of the issue is that we see that we can accomplish getting folks elected, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to follow through with legislating in the best way for our community. So I think it's really important as activists to always be able to toe that line. And I think that's what we demonstrated with that car protest.
All right, absolutely. And we want to just we want to lift it up. We have to lift it up because we have to be full spectrum in terms of the tactics and the strategies that we're going to use to bring about the just community that we seek. And then direct action is a part of that. And so that's certainly a model, what you all were able to not only pull off, but to successfully accomplish in terms of street heat upon these legislators, and let them know that they're going to be hit from the outside and the inside. So thank you again, Carleen Ponda, and thanks to all of you for giving me the assignment tonight to marshal us to this point. I was both honored and humbled to do so, and I will continue to be in service to the Maryland Coalition for Police Accountability and Justice from right here in Southern Prince George's County, Maryland. I want to pass the baton to my sister, to my comrade, Catherine Paul, who is going to not only wrap us up, but give us our marching orders going forward. I want to thank her for all the assistance, not just the assistance, but her leadership and everything that she gives to this coalition and to our struggle. Thank you, Catherine. We love you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you so much for being our host tonight. Honored again, as always. So I know we're a little bit over time. I will be very quick in wrapping us up. I put 2 links in the chat, guys, that I want you guys to save and also help us share and spread around to all of the people that you know are committed to Black liberation and transforming police, period, in Maryland. So there are a few things that that I want to flag. The first one is a form that is for organizations to fill out. That is for organizations who are interested in joining. As Jonathan mentioned early on, we started off this summer with 60 organizations signed on to our 5 demands. I think right now there are over 95 organizations that have signed on in support, and the coalition is growing. That is how we are successful, right? And as Jonathan also described, and as you saw in some of the pictures earlier, hundreds of people came out to testify at those hearings, all with the same message, right? And that's why we were so effective in getting what we did get accomplished done, was because we had hundreds of people with the same message. So if your organization, not just organization, your congregation, your school organizing group, any young folks who are ready to get organizing, would like to join the coalition, please fill that form out. We do have regular meetings where we discuss what's going on so you can stay up to date, where we organize together. All of it is online via Zoom, since we have people from all over the state. And then the second thing that is in the chat is another form that is for individuals to fill out. So we had a really crazy session this session, a lot of amazing emails coming out from Yannette, a lot of action alerts coming out from the coalition. We want to make sure that next session we do the best job we can in continuing to build the power that we have and making sure that people stay educated. So I am going to ask everyone on this call today, every single person on this call, to please take 5 minutes after this event and fill out that form. You can ask any questions, but what we really want to hear is any feedback you have, so that we can continue to grow, we can continue to build together. So please fill that out. That is it. Once you fill that out, you will have what you need to be prepared for the next steps moving forward and getting ready for the next legislative session. So once again, thank you so much to every single person on this call. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. Special thanks again to Jonathan for being our host and our leader. So appreciative. Thank you, Yannette. And we will talk to you guys soon. Link is in the chat and you'll get some follow-up soon. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Harambe!
Harambe!
All right, Harambe. Yeah, there you go, Marion.
I want my fat to
Harambe! Beautiful, beautiful. Love y'all.